Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We are going to get started with our April Classroom Connect, and it is a very popular topic. We have heard a lot of excitement for it, so it's exciting to be bringing it here to you today. It's been in the works for a while, and I'm really happy that it's finally here. My name is Joe Woolley, and I'm CEO of the Nashville LGBT Chamber. Thanks for joining us for Classroom Connect, sponsored by HCA Healthcare, TriStar Health. We are very appreciative of our member HCA for sponsoring this educational programming that we've been doing since October of 2020. We're coming into April. We have 2 more planned for you in May and then in June. And then we'll be reformatting the education program Classroom Connect. Still is going to exist, but it's going to look a little different in the fall. We'll have more details on that soon. We are streaming live to Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Thank you all for joining us, whatever platform you are on. Comments are open on all platforms for your questions and input. Send them in during the presentation at any time. Questions will be addressed during the Q&A session at the end of the program, but I will ask any questions that need to be answered or clarified immediately. So if you don't understand a term or something that we're talking about, put that in the comments and we'll make sure to clarify that. This program is part of our Rainbow Connection series. This series includes networking events, educational opportunities, and connections. Check out our website for more information on upcoming events. We've got Network Connect coming up next. We've got Member Connects, Classroom Connect, which is this program. Our Corporate Connect program, if you're not involved already, you work for a corporation around employee resource groups, diversity and inclusion initiatives, please email us and let us know, and we'll get you involved in that. So that brings me to today's program. And what an important topic, especially right now. We're going to get to the program on trans inclusion and trans issues, trans education, and it's so needed right now. Yesterday was a sad day for Tennessee, an embarrassing day for Tennessee. The first bathroom bill since North Carolina passed one in 2016 was passed by the Senate. It's been passed by the House. There's a couple paperwork issues that they have to resolve on the bill, and then it goes to the governor, and unfortunately he has signaled he will sign that. When that bill passes, it looks like it will join 4 others with a total of 5 anti-LGBT discriminatory bills that have been passed this year alone. The economic fallout, the effects on business are clear. We have been warning about that for the entire session, year after year. Unfortunately, we have not been listened to this year, and we will work to ease the fallout on the state, but it is a sad day. When we talk about these issues, transgender individuals are clearly the target, and they are the target because of the misrepresentation, the uneducation, and just general lack of knowledge that is out there around gender identity in general and trans issues in general. You can see that, and that is why they are being targeted. Because of that reason, because of the lack of information, and because that makes them an easy target, an other to be discriminated against. We have been dedicated to educating on this topic. We are going to do more. We should have been doing more, and we are committed to doing more. This is just a part of our program. We had a great transgender discussion a couple weeks ago that you can find on our website and in our video archives, where we talk to trans individuals and they share their stories and they talk about what it means to them. Personalization and humanization is very important in this process. Meeting trans individuals and understanding gender identity better is so important in the fight for trans rights. We are committed to it, and this is part of that today. I am so excited to bring you this topic. The Transgender Inclusion Classroom Connect session is going to educate and empower you to create welcoming and affirming environments for transgender employees and customers. We're going to talk about trans-affirming technology challenges how it challenges the trans community. We've got an incredible speaker, Jake Martino, my friend. It is wonderful to have you here. Jake is a board member of the Nashville LGBT Chamber. He works at Bridgestone as Director of Product Innovation and Customer Insights. Outside of work, he, as I said, is a Chamber board member. He's a co-chair of PFLAG Nashville, co-leader of a monthly transgender adult support group, and he speaks on transgender issues of inclusion and training, talking with companies and schools across the U.S. Jake, it's so great to have you here today talking to our members and our friends on this topic, and I'm so excited to hear what you have to say and educate us all.
Thank you, Joe, and Lauren as well for all of your support. I'm really excited for this. And I imagine, like me, most of the people on the line are hopping from Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting for work. So I'm really touched that you've taken time out of your day to hop on yet another video call to learn about an important topic, supporting the trans community. So I think Lauren is going to bring up the slides. And as Joe mentioned, this is kind of the first 101 type training on trans inclusion. And I'm excited for what I imagine to be a whole host of programming to follow this year and the years to come. So the ask today was to make it more basic. So for some of you, this may be review, for others, it may be new. But this really is a starting point for further discussion, collaboration, education going forward. Lauren, if you can flip to the next slide. Before I dig into the content, I just want to introduce myself a bit more so you can understand who's speaking to you. The logo on the far left, for those that understand it, recognize it, is a Hartford Whalers logo. I grew up in the Hartford, Connecticut area, and that was all we had as in terms of pro sports growing up until they moved to North Carolina. So a little bit about where I'm from. I studied at Harvard and Stanford, so lived on both coasts before moving to the South. And in terms of important people in my life, I just put a few on the screen. The far right is my girlfriend, who's actually a Nashville native, works for the Oasis Center. And in the middle there is my goddaughter, Katie. And my birth name was Katie. And so it's really nice to have, for me, that personal connection in the family. I also put on the bottom of the page a timeline of sorts of my identity disclosure and self-discovery. And it's a bit stilted to put your self-discovery on a timeline, but I just thought it would give some helpful context as we get into the material today. So I was born in '88, revealing my age, but assigned female at birth. And right around when the time I graduated college, I came out as a queer woman, a lesbian. Growing up, though, I always felt like something was very different, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. At age 6, I remember coming in crying from playing sports with the neighborhood kids because a few of the older ones who I'd just beaten at basketball told me that I was a girl and I was going to grow boobs and be bad at sports. My mom didn't really have a lot of language, wasn't very informed at the time about what the options could be, but she tried to support the best she could and just said, honey, I wouldn't worry, boobs won't slow you down, and judging by me, you won't have much anyways. But as I grew up and started to date post-college, coming out as gay, I wasn't interested at all in dating boys, and that's kind of what led me to come out as a queer woman. But in graduate school, I came out as genderqueer as I started to express and explore my gender identity. We'll get into the terminology a bit later if you don't know what that means. But each step felt a bit closer to the real me, but it wasn't until I made the leap to socially and then medically and legally transition to male that I felt really like myself, really affirmed in the identity that I had wrestled with and put down for so many years. And I say made the leap because that's very much how it felt every step of the way. Coming out, especially professionally, was one of the scariest things I've done. And medically, from a health perspective, there's always kind of questions that circulate in your mind. So that's a little bit about me. We can move forward, but I just wanted to give that personal context because a lot of the meat today will be terminology and such, but happy to go into anything about my personal experience if helpful. So I put in a slide here just to some of the interest areas that members expressed to Joe and Lauren and Raquel as well. Most importantly, we heard the need to understand terminology, to navigate transition in the workplace, and a little bit of exploring healthcare benefits and what that can mean for companies. So we'll definitely hit on all those. Just wanted to share the info that I received. Can you go forward one more? So in terms of agenda, I'll start with some opening context, just to level set on stats, key statistics about the community, Then we'll move into terminology. A lot of the words can be really new to folks, and we'll explain those. And then the third piece, we'll talk about transitioning and all of the aspects that relate to that, and also how it can be supported in the workplace for folks who are going through it. And then we'll end with Q&A. So I've got about 30 minutes of content, and I know you can submit questions on all the different platforms to Joe as we go, and he'll let me know if I should answer those during or at the end, but we'll have plenty of time for discussion and questions. All right, so to level set, one more slide, please. There's about 15 million LGBT Americans in the US. And the next slide, there's about 1.5 million transgender Americans. I think this is important because it's a minority population, but it's definitely a meaningful group. And if you can go one more slide, as many of you probably heard from the news, more and more LGBTQ folks are identifying with each generation. You can see on the far right that the Gen Zers, about 16% of them identify as LGBT versus only about 1% or 2% for the older generations. And, I think what's important to note here is that even though identity tends to be more openly expressed with the younger generations, the earliest data that we can really have, which is from the early 90s, shows that a lot of people were sharing, at least on the sexual orientation side, that they'd been having significant, extensive, more than incidental homosexual experiences, even if they may not have been identifying as gay or as lesbian as such. So there's a report from the Kinsey Institute in 1990 that about 18% of folks in 1990 reported that. And so I don't think the stat is out of whack or something like that with historical data. But I think if you can flip to the next slide, a lot of this is reflecting how rapidly, even though we have a long ways to go, societal attitudes have changed around, especially the topic of gay rights. This is a quick little clip from a Stanford study about how societal attitudes towards gay rights have changed actually more dramatically than almost any other topic in terms of the speed of change. So, I can't draw any conclusions, but I think as the world continues to get more and more supportive, we will see more and more positive change and receptivity and openness to exploring and identifying from earlier ages, which I think is great as we're all getting to know ourselves during our teen years. You can go one more slide. This has led to some important legal protections in the workplace. Actually, in June 2020, this past year, the Civil Rights Court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of '64 protects employees from discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. So this is a really huge win for all sorts of folks across the LGBT spectrum. But of course, this doesn't mean that all of our problems are solved. And in the workplace, there's some definitely troubling stats. You can flip the next slide. About 90% of transgender people, 90% have encountered some form of harassment or mistreatment on the job. So that's astounding. The next slide too is over a quarter of transgender people have lost a job due to bias. So it's great that we're starting to have these legal protections, but there's a big cultural shift that needs to happen. There's also, if you can flip forward again, other forces at play that just make day-to-day life at home, in the workplace, or in the community and in the workplace a bit harder to navigate. So restroom access is a big one, and Joe mentioned the bathroom bill, which is atrocious and sad. But about 60% of transgender folks report avoiding using a restroom, and a third actually consciously limit the amount they ate or drank to avoid it. This I remember early in my transition, especially in the workplace, I definitely avoided as much as I could because it was just uncomfortable to think, is somebody wondering, why I'm using a certain stall or urinal, and all these things racing through my head that you just kind of want to avoid it. The other stat on the bottom of this page is about 25% of identified folks were required to use the bathroom and dress based on their sex assigned at birth or were relatedly outed at a job. So this makes the workplace and just being a trans person feeling safe and welcomed in the community pretty hard. You can flip a few more or one more slide. This is the last stat I have, and it's definitely somber but important to share, that the impacts of navigating gender identity can be really severe. About 41% of transgender people reported ever attempting suicide, and this compares to 1.6% of all Americans. About 50% of transgender and non-binary youth have seriously considered suicide. So this is a really important population, to really better understand and support, because life's a little bit harder to navigate in some of these basic ways in terms of restroom access, and there can be some dire consequences. So again, just really happy that folks are dialing in and learning a little bit more so that we can have a better, more supportive community. Let's flip forward now to terminology. So the first thing I want to cover, and it's very basic, but is the acronym. I get asked all the time, what do all the letters mean in LGBTQ+? Which acronym should I use? And why so many letters? Well, part of the reason for the confusion is that different populations and generations tend to use different acronyms. As you can see on the chart, both cisgender, gay, and bi men, as well as baby boomers, tend to use LGBT or just gay when referring to the population, whereas younger generations and trans and non-binary folks and cisgender, lesbian, and bi women are most likely to use LGBTQ+. My recommendation would be to use LGBTQ+, as that's the most inclusive way to refer to the entire community. And the plus, by the way, is a means of signifying that others, such as people who identify as asexual, are also included. So the reason for so many letters is that the human language, of course, is constantly evolving, and we're finding more accurate and inclusive ways of referring to groups of people with varying identities, but shared experiences of identifying outside of cisgender and straight. You can flip again. I know I've mentioned a lot of terms, so we'll kind of go through some of the main ones now in more detail. To start, it's really critical to establish the difference between sex, gender identity, and gender expression. Everyone is assigned a sex at birth, and it's either male, female, or potentially intersex. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term intersex, intersex people represent about the same percentage of the population as redheads, just about 2% of people. And intersex people are those who are biologically between the medically expected definitions of male and female. And this can be for a variety of reasons. It could be due to hormonal differences, chromosomal differences, or secondary sex characteristics. The reason why I think this is important to underscore is that oftentimes there's this conception that biological sex is black and white, and it really isn't, and it hasn't been since the beginning of time. Now, gender identity, the second main bullet on the page, is not something others can see. This is an internal, subjective experience of being. Someone can experience their identity as male, as female, as neither, as both, honestly, whatever they know themselves to be. Just as I may know myself to be a dog lover, where my mom is not, despite the fact that I never grew up with dogs. Gender expression, the last bullet there, this is the external manifestation of gender, expressed through one's name, one's pronouns, clothing, et cetera, et cetera. And the interesting thing here is that gender expression is constantly changing. For example, pink used to be a male color before World War II because it was perceived to be the stronger, bolder color. Female colors were associated with blue, with roots to Mother Mary in the Christian tradition. And today, of course, that's flipped. You know, pants used to be a male-only thing. Now anyone can wear pants. So as society continues to challenge gender stereotypes, forms of gender expression will continue to evolve. If you can flip ahead, when we talk about gender identity, there are really two main categories, umbrella categories, if you will, cisgender and transgender. I've already mentioned these terms a bit. Cisgender is someone whose gender identity is aligned with their sex. So, for example, my sister was assigned female at birth and identifies as female, so she's a cisgender female. And same for my brother, who was born assigned male at birth and identifies as male. Transgender is the umbrella category to describe someone whose gender identity differs in varying degrees from their assigned sex at birth. So this could be female, male, non-binary, and a variety of other terms that people identify with to express, again, an identity that differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. So myself, transgender man, and my siblings, my friend's younger sibling, who identifies as non-binary, would all be kind of captured into this transgender category. Flip to the next slide, please. One thing that's super important when referring to trans people, and it's typically an innocent mistake that I see people make all the time, is how do you refer to transgender people, depending on what time period you're referencing them in. And really, you should always use the name and pronoun that they've asked you to use, regardless of if you're referring to them in the past, the present, or the future. So to make this crystal clear, I'll share a silly example using myself, so apologies for the third person. But for example, I've known Jake for 20 years. When he was a kid, he loved basketball. I remember his coach used to say, Jake, keep practicing and you may just make it to the NBA. Look at him now. I think he will be better than LeBron pretty soon. So again, whether you're referring to somebody's, during their childhood time or in the future or right now, use the same name and pronouns that they've asked you to use. There are some caveats, of course. If they've asked you to refer to them by other names and pronouns with folks that they're not out to, then respect that, of course. And an example of that is I've out to everybody in my life except for my great aunt, who's 95 and blind. And so I've asked my family, my cousins, aunts, uncles, parents to refer to me as Katie with she, her, just to her specifically when she's present. Because personally, I didn't feel the need to come out to her and have that desire to come out to her. And so it makes it a little bit harder, I think, sometimes for them to switch back and forth. But for me, that's the only time that I prefer being referred to by my birth name and birth pronouns. Sexual orientation, a key topic to take away today, key learning, is that sexual orientation has nothing to do with the terms that we discussed: assigned sex at birth, gender identity, or gender expression. It's completely separate. So sexual orientation is your feelings of emotional, romantic, or sexual attraction towards others. And I've listed some common ones here. You've probably heard of gay and lesbian and bisexual. I myself identify as a straight transgender man, as a heterosexual transgender man. But of course, there are countless others, such as pansexual and bisexual. And one statistic that I find really enlightening about where we are at as a society today is that only 28% of bisexual people report that they are out to important people in their lives. And this compares to about 70% plus of gay and lesbian identified people. And of the 72% of bisexual people that are not out and who are in committed relationships, the vast majority report being in an opposite sex or opposite gender heterosexual relationship. And so this just goes to show how similar to gender identity, it's hard for folks to share stuff when, in terms of identity, when their lived experience may be different from what others perceive it to be, and especially when it falls outside of the binary man, woman, gay, straight. So to wrap up the terminology section, there's a common exercise done in trainings, and I'll just walk through it for myself. Given tech limitations, we won't all be able to do this. I know a variety of groups use this for trainings, and I think it's a great tool to bring it all together. But the gender unicorn, you can see gender identity, gender expression, assigned sex at birth, physical attraction, and emotional attraction, all put on a spectrum here on the page. And it really helps you to think through, and if you ever do any trainings with your employees, can help others think through their identity and how that may compare to others and show the diversity of the people that are in this world. So for gender identity, I would plot myself far to the right on the man, male, boy spectrum, and completely to the other side of the female and other spectrums. For gender expression, I tend to present more masculinely, so I'd plot myself fairly to the right of that. But of course, I wear pink and I have other types of clothes and forms of expression that others may consider feminine or other. So I'd probably put myself a little bit to the right of the feminine and other spectrum, but primarily the far right of the masculine spectrum. Assigned sex at birth, I've shared that I was assigned female. In terms of physical attraction, I've shared that I identify as straight and attracted to women. And then on emotional attraction, which we haven't talked too much about, but these are your feelings of closeness, ability to really jive with somebody and feel connected in an emotional way. I would put myself far to the right for women, men, and other in terms of ability to form those deep, meaningful relationships with people of all gender identities. So again, this is just an exercise to help you think through how all of these different parts of identity really are on a spectrum. And I guarantee if we had 100 people do this, there'd be little dots marked on the page all over the place, which is great. All right. So the next key topic to talk about, of course, is the topic of transitioning. And first off, the word transitioning is increasingly being replaced by the term affirming, because definitionally my identity is male. So any actions I take or choose to take are affirming that identity, not changing that identity. There are three main types of affirming actions that folks may take. The first category of actions are social affirmations. These are things like changing name and pronouns, changing clothing, changing hair, etc. All those things that kind of communicate your identity in the form of gender expression. The second is legal. Legal affirmation can include things like driver's license, social security, birth certificate, bank, insurance. I mean, think of everything where you have a name in a legal way. That's all about the legal transition. And the medical side, which the press probably puts the most emphasis on, tends to be about hormones and surgery. For hormones, this can be testosterone, estrogen, etc. For surgery, this can be breast removal, or bottom surgery can be different things there too. And then, of course, there's other types of surgeries. Some of this can involve the removal of facial hair for trans women. So there's a variety of different surgeries that can be available in different situations. But before we move on from this page, I also want to highlight that there is no one way to be transgender. There is no start point or end point that's clear cut. My identity is male. I've been a trans male. That's who I am. It didn't start on one specific date and time, and it hasn't ended on one specific date and time. And people can choose to take affirming actions in any ways or in no ways. And regardless of how someone chooses to affirm themselves with these different actions, they are still the gender identity that they identify as. So you don't need to take any affirming change or you shouldn't need to take any affirming change to be respected for the identity that you share with others. So let's go into these three. Oh yeah, first of all, I have a pop-up question here, which we don't have a discussion feasibility with the service, but I want to highlight that, why might some transgender people not make any or certain changes? And there's so many reasons for this. These reasons typically can include cost and insurance barriers. Pre-existing health conditions can preclude people, sometimes even if they want to make changes. I often hear about safety concerns, especially with trans folks that I work with in rural parts of the state, that it's just not going to be safe for me to do it right now, to have those progressive hormonal changes or to make surgical changes in my environment. There's also, of course, the reason that some people don't feel the need. Maybe they like their name as it is, and they feels like that affirms their identity, and they don't feel a need to change it. So there can be a whole host of reasons why people may or may not choose to take action. All right. So going into the three forms, yeah.
I'm sorry, can I jump in real fast, Lauren? If you could go back to the previous slide. I got a text from somebody up at the legislature that's watching, and I do want to just bring up a point. Lauren, go back one more so that cloud is off the slide. One of the things they just texted me to bring up is these are different ways for a trans person to transition, but they are at certain stages of development. And it is trans youth who are being targeted with a lot of these laws. And there is not surgery options for anyone under the age of 18. That is already, that is not the practice of pediatricians when they are working with transgender youth. And the access to hormones, it's important to note that puberty blockers are prescribed to trans youth to allow them time to develop and decide and understand gender identity issues better, so it is an easier transition. If there is anything that you can add to that, I think it's important with what we are facing with transgender healthcare bills to be very clear with what trans youth are have access to and what their treatment and access is, and then what happens after in adulthood, what trans healthcare looks like.
Sure. No, it's a good point. Thanks for underscoring that. Oftentimes, I have heard, especially with my work at PFLAG, that trans youth do choose to go on blockers. And what this does is it delays the onset of puberty, so that your body doesn't, in my case, I feminized and got my period and all sorts of things right before I transitioned as an adult to male with testosterone. So blockers are often a great way to minimize the dysphoria. Dysphoria is the feeling that you're not aligned in your body to what you feel inside to be. And so this can often have really strong mental health benefits for youth. The key with blockers, and I'm not a medical professional, but you do have to start them within a certain window, because obviously they block the onset of puberty. So for some youth, it may not be an option if they're too far into puberty. The other thing is you can't be on them forever. I don't remember the exact time limit, maybe 2 years or something like that. But there is a piece at which you can no longer stay on blockers just medically. So it's a great solution for some youth who, like Joe said, may want more time to settle into their gender identity. But it is too bad that there's not more options than that, either medically or legally or socially. I have heard of some folks under 18 being able to get surgery in certain places, but it really varies state to state and prescriber and surgeon to surgeon. So
to be clear on that, Tennessee does not allow that. Just as it is different with birth certificate and name changes, state to state on what the law is. So
that's right.
Thank you very much, Jake, for clarifying that. It's just an important point to make with what we're dealing with around legislation.
Yeah, and I will say there's always this fear with youth of detransitioning, and so far that hasn't really proven to be an issue with stats, that kids don't regret it later on. But there's still a lot of research to be had about any medical type of intervention. But the most part, the emphasis really is on, for kids that show persistent, insistent identity, it's really much better for their mental health to make the changes that they need to make. So I was going to go through each of these 3 forms of transitioning just briefly. And the first one, social transitioning. Social transitioning can be really exciting and also really jarring for people, because trans people often go from experiencing the world and being perceived one way to experiencing the world and being perceived a completely different way. So I've shared 2 quotes here. One is from the actress Laverne Cox, who said, "When I was perceived as a Black man, I became a threat to public safety. When I was dressed as myself, it was my safety that was threatened." There's another quote from an anonymous source, but that's often shared. Conversely, I went from the most invisible form in our society, a Black female, to the most feared in our society, a Black male. And so, there's something, beautiful about the perspective gained, but also terrifying. And there can be many challenges with going from these different perceptions in a fairly short period of time. If you can flip another slide on social transitioning, I wanted to emphasize the word disclosure. That's typically the word that's used in terms of sharing your trans identity. Coming out is often used colloquially with sexual orientation. Disclosure is probably the more appropriate term for gender identity. And it's important here to share that even if someone discloses their transgender identity to you, please make sure, unless they are completely disclosed in all facets of life that you are aware of, make sure that you have their consent to share it. One thing I've experienced in different places that I've lived and worked is people really are excited to share, hey, so-and-so at my company or my friend is transitioning, and can I connect you with them? And they're going from this to this, and here's their name. And I always ask, I'm happy to help, but my question is, do you have their consent to share this with me? It's really important to respect along the process for safety concerns, for just respect, if they're comfortable with that being shared. So very important to underscore on the social side. But let's move now to the legal side of affirmation. As Joe mentioned, Tennessee is one of 3 states that does not allow amendments or new issuances of birth certificates. And the legal side of transitioning really varies state to state. Tennessee here, one of the hardest. You can change your driver's license if you're born here and if you live here, but you can't change your birth certificate. And this affects people that live in California but were born in Tennessee. Nothing they can do. You can't change their birth certificate. It's going to trigger things on their background check for every job they get for the rest of their lives. In Tennessee, that's a big thing that you cannot do, unfortunately, in one of 3 states. But again, these things do vary state to state. I will say on the driver's license side of things, California is a state that you can actually change your gender marker to be male, female, or non-binary. So California is even a bit advanced on the driver's license versus here in Tennessee, you can only get it changed to male or female. So legal affirmation is a process. It is a journey. It takes a long time to get every single reference point, whether it's insurance, banks, airlines, utilities, all aligned to your correct name and pronouns. And it's a really long process for folks, and it really does vary state to state about what they're able to get changed if they choose to. In addition to the hassle of it, some laws, as Joe mentioned in the beginning, can make these types of situations, such as the bathroom, really disaffirming and also have some unintended consequences. So bathroom legislation comes up all the time, and this is a viral post, I think from a year or so ago, of a trans man who went into the women's bathroom and says, do I look like I belong here? And again, in Tennessee, if you can't change your birth certificate, but you're able to have surgery, take hormones, change your driver's license, etc., and there's a bill that says you have to use the restrooms and the facilities, locker rooms, etc., associated with your birth certificate, this can happen. And so again, I would just encourage, hopefully down the line, legislatures all get there, but let people use the facility that is aligned with their identity, as opposed to trying to put people into these black and white boxes. That just doesn't make sense in the broader context. And lastly, on medical, we talked a little bit about it, so I'll just touch on here in terms of medical coverage, especially for the employers on the call. So companies and organizations are thankfully increasingly offering coverage, and most that I've spoken to, the biggest barrier they've faced is not cost, but it's really awareness. Typically, they have to have a trans person on staff for people to think about this as an option to add to their plans. But importantly, that June 2020 Supreme Court ruling, while it does not provide a coverage mandate for employee-sponsored plans, companies really should review their coverage and clinical policies, because discrimination in certain compliance areas can be an issue. So for example, denial of gender affirmation services deemed medically necessary, where the same services would be covered if deemed medically necessary for a different condition, that would raise Title VII risks. And certain limits on trans treatment for gender dysphoria, which is a medically defined diagnosis, could also violate the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act if they're not on par with limits on medical and surgical benefits. So again, you have to treat transgender people equally. So there's not a mandate for a specific type of coverage, but you do have to make sure the mental health benefits you're providing, the surgical, et cetera, that's equal for all people. With regards to cost, though, even though this isn't a typical concern, there's been some research done by, oh gosh, I can't remember the group. It's on the, I can't read it because it's too small on the bottom of the slide, but employers can typically expect 1 to 2 claimants for every 10,000 employees. And the typical annual cost per claimant really varies based on the needs of the individual. So hormones, prescription, typically for life and fairly low cost. Surgeries can really range from 15 to 75,000 depending, and these are more one-time costs typically. So I just wanted to give that overview, and the main thing to impress here is review your plans. Think of it, because otherwise you'll probably have to cross that barrier at some point, and you could be at risk for compliance issues and discrimination issues, depending on the other benefits that you offer to your employees. So we've just talked about a lot of things. I wanted to give a short 2-minute clip from Jackson Bird, a transgender guy, just so you can hear some of these topics and experience addressed by someone who isn't me. So Lauren, if you could play the 2-minute clip. Thanks.
Afterwards, because you also don't ever stop coming out. I came out to the accountant helping with my taxes and the TSA agents who didn't know which one of them should pat me down, the man or the woman. I mean, I just came out to everyone watching this. When I came out to my dad, to my great relief, he was totally cool with me being trans. But as soon as I started talking about physically transitioning, he freaked. And I quickly realized it was because he, like so many other people, think that physical transition means just one thing, the surgery. Now listen, if there were one magical surgery that could turn me into a tall, muscular, societally perfect image of a man overnight, I'd sign up in a heartbeat. Unfortunately, it isn't that simple. There are dozens of different gender-affirming surgeries, from chest surgeries to bottom surgeries to facial feminization and man sculpting. Many trans people will only ever undergo one procedure in their lifetime, if that. Maybe because they don't personally feel the need, but also because they're expensive and health insurance is only beginning to cover them. Instead, the first step for a trans person seeking physical transition is usually hormone replacement therapy. Hormones are why I have a deeper voice and some sparse whiskers on my neck and a giant pimple on my chin. Basically, they put you through a second puberty. It's a blast. Now, because our transitions are slower and steadier than historic misconceptions can lead people to believe, there can be some confusion about when to call someone by their new name and pronouns. There's no distinct point in physical transition at which a trans person becomes their true gender. As soon as they tell you their new name and pronouns, that's when you start using that name and pronouns. And I know it can be difficult to make the change. You might slip up here and there. I've slipped up myself with other trans people. But, you know, I always think to myself, if we can change from calling Puff Daddy to P. Diddy, and if we apologize profusely when we've used the wrong gender pronoun for someone's pet cat, I mean, I think we can make the same effort for the real humans in our lives.
Thanks, Lauren. So I hope that was helpful to hear from another voice. I wanted to end with a few tips for navigating transitions in the workplace, as I know many of the people on this call are employees or HR leaders and others at businesses. So first, establish and uphold trans-inclusive policies, employee-led disclosure processes, and other benefits. When I transitioned in California at the workplace, the culture was very affirming, very welcoming, but they hadn't really ever reviewed their policies, and they actually welcomed me into the fold to help review those and write those policies and review their broader discrimination policies and such. And in terms of employee-led disclosure, it's really important to involve the person who's going through it with how they want to navigate it. Who do they email? Who should they meet with in person? Who should they, what's the day when they start using different bathrooms if that's going to be a big moment for them? Lean on the person who's transitioning in the workplace to try to guide what's comfortable for them, and make sure that you're thoughtful about not setting a precedent for how all transgender employees must proceed if they transition in your workplace. So that's kind of number one. Be employee-led and review your policies and benefits to be as inclusive as possible. Number two, again, follow the employee's lead on disclosure, timing, and methods. And this is especially for internal records and all sorts of things like your Outlook, right? If the employee is going to be changing their name, make sure that the day that it's changed, everything on Outlook, everything on your Workday or your HR systems, that everything's consistent, because it can be really awkward and disaffirming if there's this big announcement for the trans person and then everything else is still, their old identity is still in the system and reflected publicly. So make sure everything happens in sync. Number three is try to institute gender neutral bathrooms, or at least encourage trans employees to use the bathrooms again that align with their gender identity. This should be a pretty easy one. Usually in the bathroom, people are trying to get in and get out and get on with their workday and rush to the next meeting. So don't make it any harder than it needs to be. The fourth one is try, if you have a dress code, to implement gender neutral dress codes. This is particularly important in retail environments and customer service environments, but try to allow people to dress obviously the way that they want to. Number five is pay attention and respect names and pronouns. When I transitioned in the workplace, my boss set a great example. I don't know how she did it, but she never messed up my name and pronouns. And it set a really good precedent, her intentionality, for everybody else to also bring that same intentionality. Of course, some people, are going to slip up, family, friends, employees, but especially in a leadership position, try to bring that extra intentionality to make somebody feel welcome and make everybody, be respectful. And the last thing is, please don't ask somebody how they're transitioning, how long they've been transgender, if their transition is complete, what surgeries they're getting. Again, some of these things are just not even true. There's no definitive date when your transition is complete. And other things are just really personal. Obviously, any sort of surgical or medical action that people take, whether they're transgender or otherwise, tends to be really private. So give it the same form of respect. So we're at 11:45. I will stop here. I hope this was helpful as a 101. I know there's going to be more programming. So thank you for having me, Joe and Lauren. And any questions that came in, I'd love to try to address.
Yeah, if you have questions, if you're watching out there, please submit them in the comment section of whatever platform you're watching us on. And Jake, that was great. Thank you so much for covering that. It was a great 101. I continually learn. I learned today, and I hope others have. One of the things that I think came up that I have talked about and that you referenced that we should, I think, expand on is what happens when you slip up. And I think people are so afraid sometimes or hesitant to talk about trans issues because there are some terms that you may not know about or you're not sure about, and you don't want to offend anybody or upset anybody, so you just don't talk about it. And I think what you do when you are not trans and you slip up is important. And then I'd love for you to also answer that for what you do if someone slips up and you are trans, because I think there are really great ways to handle it in both settings.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the main thing is to not make a big deal about it. Don't draw extra attention profusely for your own embarrassment. If you can, correct yourself quickly and then move on. And I will say that it is hard. I mean, I myself has slipped up with other trans and non-binary folks that I've known for a long, long time. And so this is not something that's unique to cisgender people that they struggle with. Anytime you have to make a mental switch, it can be hard when your muscle memory is used to saying something else. But intentionality is the key. The other thing I'll say, just a little tip, is change the person's name and pronouns in your phone. Wherever you tend to, to reference them, try to change it there. When you're talking to friends and family, when they're not present, make sure you use it with them and correct it with them. The more you use it, the more you'll be likely to retain it. So that would be my main advice there. And not to feel too bad, but to be intentional and correct yourself and quickly move on.
Yeah. And what about speaking to trans individuals when somebody slips up, how to approach them when they do slip up?
For trans folks approaching others? Yeah, well, it depends on the situation. I know my dad, he struggled with my transition at first, but came around fairly quickly. So I'm grateful for that. And he's never messed up my name and pronouns since. He, I think, over the top tries to say, hey, man, hey, dude, how's it going? He tries to use these masculine words. My mom, though, it's taken her a long time. She still messes up sometimes, especially when she talks fast or is excited. So sometimes, in those situations, I've had to talk to my mom about, this really matters to me, and you're really the only person who messes up now in the family. Like this, can you please try to get this right? And she always feels bad because she doesn't mean to. But so there's kind of that level of one-on-one. I think sometimes in the workplace, you don't want to make anyone look bad in front of a group, but taking them aside one-on-one and potentially leveraging HR if there's a persistent issue as a good neutral third-party intermediary. Hopefully your boss can be supportive and kind of HR to help navigate those things. So I would recommend using those channels if needed.
Yeah, definitely an ongoing thing. There should be other people brought in, especially in the workplace, and you can respond in stronger ways if you are continually being misgendered. But I think it's really important to emphasize that if someone is trying in good faith and they slip up, sometimes the worst thing we can do is attack the person or make them feel stupid or bad for saying something, because we don't educate, we don't bring them with us when we do attack. You want to educate them, definitely educate them, but it's about how you do it to help bring them along and allow them to be educated so then they can go and educate others. I think that's an important thing in this discussion is how we correct people and how we bring people along with us.
Yeah, and I haven't heard of too many people, getting all angry and upset when they've been misgendered. For the most part, they just feel awkward and they want the person, but they don't want to make them feel bad. But I agree. I think education is key, of course, and trying to give everyone the benefit of the doubt unless really proven otherwise.
We have a question from Sarah Weber.
Yeah.
How do you reassure your trans employees that they are accepted in the workplace when state legislature isn't supportive?
Thanks, Sarah, for that question. And I'll reiterate a few things from the presentation and add a few new things. Number one, your cultural policies are what you make them. So you can have more inclusive bathroom policies than the government, mandates. Same thing with benefits. So you can really make those steps and make them publicized, not just your once a year benefits, assignment, but, throughout the year, as you advertise many other things internally in terms of benefits. So that's one thing. I think other things, you can very easily offer people and encourage people to put their pronouns in their email signatures, right? And whenever I see that, and I know a lot of other folks, when they see that, it just gives a signal that this person's aware and probably a safe person and a accepting person in terms of the LGBT spectrum holistically, even aside from trans folks. So I think that's a great way to signal not just acceptance, but really welcome through pronoun usage. Depending on your culture, depending on the type of meeting, often when meeting new people, it can be a great chance to just say, hey, what pronouns do you prefer? And some people may get caught off by that because it's not typical. But in a first meeting, I think that's absolutely a wonderful thing, especially in interviews. So I'll transition now to kind of the interview topic. But that's a really great way in any sort of talent acquisition, promotional activities, even things like when you're applying for a job, you often have to say if you're male or female. A lot of companies now are adding other options and other selectors for that. So there's a lot of external materials and internal things you can do to signal. One last thing I'll say about trans acceptance in the workplace, and I think this goes with other minority groups too, but on the talent acquisition side, I try when I'm hiring folks to give case studies, because oftentimes everyone has bias of folks that are more like them to want to hire. But if you put everyone through the same assessment of what the job will really require, you get a much less biased hiring process. And so again, this isn't just trans specific, but think of ways where you can remove discrimination in general and signal acceptance more broadly, would be my recommendation.
Yeah, that is great. Spot on. That's what we here at the Chamber help our business members do. And you are so right with pronouns being a signal. We have a lot of allies that have asked, I'm clearly male or I'm clearly female. Why would I need to do that? And it's not about you. It's about
That's
the right. Nobody's questioning that you're male or female or how you're presenting. It's about a signal that you give in your signature and out to the world that says, I see this issue. I respect this issue, and you're included. And it's about diversity and inclusion around that. So great point there. How I want to kind of answer that too is, how do you reassure your trans employees that they're accepted with what's going on right now? I want to take it a step further and talk about employees that have trans children, because that's the other thing that these bills are affecting. It's affecting parents of trans youth that are living in this state. I think it's important for companies, like Jake said, not to just put it in their policies or highlight their HRC Equality Index score once a year when it comes out, or join the chamber and say we're a chamber member. Talk about it. These things are happening and you need to address it. And I think you need to come out openly and say, this goes against our company policies and we are aware of it and we are against this, and you are included and valued here. And here are the policies that we have for you to bring your authentic self to work, your whole self to work. And we understand that this affects your family and you living here. That's what is important. That's what companies can do more of.
Yeah, two more things if I can add. So one on that same front is a lot of parents with PFLAG have expressed things like, well, wait, if this law passes, one of my kids can play sports and the other can't, or what? It just creates a lot of discrimination even within households of how kids are kind of allowed to participate and grow up. So just wanted to underscore that I think companies can play a big voice in just community issues that affect their employees directly or people in their family. The second thing I wanted to add, which is kind of going back to the original question, so apologize, but oftentimes in the LGBT community, the T can be a little forgotten sometimes, depending on the population. So, there's sexual orientation, there's gender identity, there's all these facets that make up the LGBTQ plus population. So if you're having a broad event, try to label it something that's broad, right? As opposed to like a love is love event that is more signaling sexual orientation. So if it's an event specifically about that, label it that. If it's really broadly for the whole community, make it something that's broader in terminology. That can also be a signal, even just from folks who are gay or lesbian, that they're aware and are advocates as well.
That is a wonderful point. And education that we have to do within the rest of this acronym right here. The amount of lesbians and gays that have come forward, members that have come forward and said, hey, I need help understanding why is this an issue? I don't understand gender identity. I have been asked, why are we spending political capital on this? And we have moved past that as a community. This organization, and I hope the LGBT community at large, is not all right leaving our trans siblings behind. It has happened before in our civil rights struggle, and it cannot happen now when transgender people are being attacked at a level never seen before, I feel. But it's sexual orientation, and then it's gender identity. Those are different, and the education piece is so important to understand that. But we are a community and we are marginalized, and trans people are on the top of the list right now being attacked. But it was just a few, years ago, a few months ago, that it was gays and lesbians being attacked. You make a great point about like pride and love is love. Be specific, say what you're supporting, because you're right, the trans community can be left out of that. On the acronym LGBT and then Q+, you talk about Q+ being the most broadly accepted, and I do see that out there the most. We at the Chamber use LGBT because it's for a couple of reasons. It's the 4 certifications that we can certify, that you can prove, and what the national gives out for LGBT business enterprises. Those 4 categories, they don't, you can't certify it under the category. But also, you showed those demographics in that slide. The Chamber members that we have polled, and it matches that same information, where around 30, 35, queer goes from being a identifier to a derogatory word. And the terminology is often the first question I get asked, and I love that you led with that when I go talk to companies, is what does it all stand for? What does it all mean? Anything there that you wanted to expand on?
No, I think I'm glad that you brought that up and touched on it. Again, I think anytime you have LGBT, it's kind of the clearest chunk of commonly used letters. And so I think it makes sense in terms of certifying businesses and such. I think when you're referring to a population in broader language, at work or with friends, giving that plus sign, especially even regardless of the Q, really shows kind of the rest of the spectrum is recognized. So there's different reasons and different vernacular, and to your point, associations with different words such as queer. My parents' generation, that was definitely a discriminatory word that they would not want to say, versus now it's not. So it's not that there's one that's completely right or completely wrong. It's just thinking about the usage in different situations. That's all.
Yeah. How PFLAG? Share a little bit more about PFLAG and how and what you're feeling, and what that group is feeling with the discriminatory legislation that's going on right now.
Yeah, it's really hard for parents right now of trans and non-binary youth. I think medical decisions for kids and social decisions for kids should just be left to the family and medically to their providers. You see the medical association across the country, whether mental health or medical health. I mean, everybody's coming out in support of supporting trans youth with what they need, whether that be blockers or hormones or et cetera. So I see this as just really a step in the wrong direction, and it's causing our parents that participate in PFLAG a lot of strife. Again, it's bringing in discrimination into their communities. And these are all people who work for companies like we all do, and their kids are active in school, and they're trying to form healthy habits and teamwork and all these things you learn from sports. I was an athlete in college, and I'll just say there's a lot of this talk, specifically trans women taking spots from girls, and that's just not the right focus, and not even necessarily true. Not all trans people like sports, are good at sports. Colleges, when they're going through the recruiting process, are looking for someone typically that is going to be a strong 4-year performer, and hormones typically take a year or so to kind of equate. So this is not like something that people are thinking about, simplistically at the collegiate level. I think people should focus on the core of youth sports, and that's teamwork, that's friendship, that's health, that's perseverance, and all the character building things that are most important for trans kids to develop, is that grit, that integrity, that teamwork, that collaboration. And so to put a law in place, especially on the sports side, that precludes them from participation is just really short-sighted. And I think using kind of women as a scare tactic is just an opening into further discrimination. Because if you're going to legislate hormones and you're going to legislate prescription medication, does that mean if you're on birth control, you shouldn't be able to participate? Does that mean if you're on asthma medication, you have an advantage? I mean, where does it stop? So I think you have to allow people to participate as they identify. And this, again, to your point, Joe, there's a lot of misinformation on what this could actually mean for further discrimination down the line. It's just an easy entrance point.
27 states play bill this year. Idaho passed it last year, and it's already been deemed unconstitutional. So you start there, that it's clearly a national tactic and they're targeting trans people. But the messaging on it, you know, unfortunately, politically, it's kind of genius because you're protecting girls in sports from getting scholarships. And we have had, you know, lesbian members of ours that have said, hey, I put myself through college on a scholarship and I shouldn't have competed against men. And I'm like, stop right there. You're taking what they're trying to tell you and sell this bill as. That is not, you know, what's happening. It's not like Frank gets up in the morning, puts on a wig and decides he needs a scholarship and says he's transgender and goes out and beats up girls on the lacrosse field. You know, that isn't what's happening. First, it's not happening in general. They can't point to cases here in Tennessee. There's only been 4 cases that they can really highlight where a transgender individual has wanted to compete and play in sports. But it's not like you get to just wake up and say, I'm transgender and I want to compete against girls. It's just so much misinformation, and it's so sad. You know, I thank you for doing this because it is so important to put forward trans individuals to show the youth that we're working on this, it's getting better. You are heard. Anything you want to say to a young transgender person out there right now, who I, you know, keep in the front of my mind when we talk about this.
Yeah. I would just say that it's a journey, and it's, you know, everyone's trying to do what they can that supports you to make the world a better place. That's why we're all speaking out. So it should get better. It has gotten better for me and almost everybody else I know, but just keep on keeping on and we'll all do our part, hopefully.
It gets better. It may seem tough right now, but it's going to get better. So,
That's right.
Jake, I want to share this one comment and then we're going to wrap up. Kia Goodwin says, I'm proud of Jake on our DE&I steering committee, helping the team shape policies for our all our teammates. Kudos today, Jake. Great job. I 100% echo that, Jake. Thank you so much for coming on and presenting this today, for everything you do for the community and for the chamber. This was great. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Kia. And thanks, Joe and Lauren. Really appreciate it.
Well, that wraps up our April Classroom Connect. We're looking forward to bringing you May and June. Thanks again to our sponsors, HCA Healthcare and TriStar Health, for sponsoring this education series. We are committed to continuing to educate the community on a number of issues, educate our members on a number of issues, and like I said, we're dedicated to education on the transgender community and gender identity issues. Look forward to more of this programming and other topics. Thank you all for being a member and joining us today. We'll talk to you soon.